The story revolves around a young couple, Fabiola and Roy, and their little girl, Teresa. Lately, Teresa has been having nightmares about a big dog because the neighbors have a German Shepherd who is not very friendly towards her. After a basketball game, Roy chats with their neighbor, Shava. They both want to improve the relationship between their families as things could be better between their wives. In the end, they come up with the idea to have dinner together that night. Later, Shava and his wife, Anai, come over to invite their neighbors to dinner. Fabiola and Roy agree to go but can't leave their daughter alone, so they ask the neighbors to lock up their dog for a while so Teresa can come too. Anai reluctantly agrees but dislikes the idea of locking up her dog. That night, during dinner, while the dog is locked up, they talk a bit about their jobs. We learn that Shava and Anai met while trying to free pigs from a breeding farm, which is a more exciting story than we met on Tinder. It is revealed that both are actively involved in protecting animal rights. As the conversation continues, their dog, Jagger, suddenly starts barking very loudly, which upsets Fabiola, as she thought the dog had been locked up. Anai then tries to introduce Jagger to Teresa in a calm way, but the dog starts to bark again, startling the little girl. Enraged by the confrontation, Fabiola grabs her daughter and storms out. When she returns home, Fabiola pours her frustration on her husband, feeling that they have nothing in common with their stupid neighbors. She is also bothered by the fact that they treat their dog like a child. The next day, before leaving for school, Teresa can't find her favorite doll. After searching everywhere in the house, she suddenly sees Jagger tearing it apart. Teresa bravely tries to get her doll back by picking up a stone. However, before she can strike, the dog counterattacks and bites her arm. Before things get worse, Fabiola arrives with dog repellent and sprays Jagger to scare him away. The scene then shifts to the hospital. The doctor informs Fabiola and Roy that Teresa's injury is serious and she might lose mobility in her arm. The little girl needs to go to therapy to strengthen her mobility. When Shava and Anai find out what happened, they visit the hospital and bring a stuffed animal dog as a gift for Teresa. However, they refuse to apologize for what their dog did and instead question why Teresa was near their dog in the first place. Fabiola is clearly mad at the couple and refuses to accept the stuffed toy, arguing with them. That night, Roy calls the police to report the incident, but they say it doesn't fall under their jurisdiction, so they can't take any action. Unwilling to give up, Fabiola insists on doing something about the dog. She suggests calling her friend Marcos, who is a lawyer and has some contacts with the local authorities. Roy likes the idea and immediately calls Marcos for help. A few days later, the authorities arrive to take Jagger away. Anai screams and protests, insisting they leave him alone and even suggesting they take the girl instead, claiming she was at fault, but they don't listen to her and forcibly take the dog away. At this point, the situation is completely out of Roy's hands. His friend decides to take Jagger to an illegal kennel to have him put down in a very cruel manner. Back at home, Roy and Fabiola discuss everything that happened. They question whether their actions were right and start blaming each other. Roy regrets involving Marcos, feeling they should never have called him in the first place. That night, the couple suddenly experiences a power outage in their house. In the meantime, Teresa wakes up from her sleep, claiming she saw the dog watching her through the window all night, but her mother reassures her that it's probably just a nightmare and encourages her to rest. The next day, Roy and Fabiola find out the power outage was caused by someone tampering with the electricity near their house. They learn from a neighbor that they had seen Anai lurking around their backyard the other night. The couple decides to talk directly with Shava to prevent it from happening again. Surprisingly, Shava admits his wife's mistake and apologizes for the inconvenience. He also informs them that they have decided to leave their house and start fresh somewhere else. Before departing, they leave a stuffed dog at their neighbor's house. Unfortunately, they also slash all the tires on Fabiola's car. It seemed like things were going too well. That night, Roy and Fabiola feel much calmer as their creepy neighbors are no longer around. However, Teresa wakes up once again claiming the dog is watching her through the window. This concerns the parents, and they eventually decide to investigate. As they check outside, they feel like someone is watching them. Roy then heads out to inspect the yard, leaving his wife and daughter safe inside, but Fabiola soon finds out that the burglar alarm isn't working. Meanwhile, Roy receives a call from Marcos but is too occupied to answer. Fabiola then receives the call on their landline phone. Marcos informs her that he tried to investigate the creepy neighbors and found something very disturbing about them. It turns out Shava and Anai were using fake names the whole time, and this is not the first instance in which they have done so. In the yard, Roy discovers a half-finished cigarette and realizes that their neighbors are still lurking nearby. Determined to end the supposed pranks, he sets out to find them. Back at the house, Teresa holds the stuffed animal dog in her hands and stays close to her mom. At this moment, Fabiola notices one of the windows is open and suspects that someone else might be inside. So, the two lock themselves in Teresa's room for safety. As Roy continues his search for the neighbors, he is suddenly startled by a man wearing a dog mask. The man then attacks him and cuts open his knee with a sharp object. In the meantime, Fabiola tries to distract her daughter when suddenly they hear knocking on the door. They decide not to open it, but someone from outside breaks the lock. It turns out to be Anais, wearing another dog mask. Determined to keep the intruder out, Fabiola uses all her might to lock the door from the inside. She somehow manages to injure Anais' palm and successfully keeps her out. After a few minutes, there's another knock on the door. Thankfully, this time they hear Roy's voice. Although he is excessively bleeding from one of his knees, he has managed to make it to the room. The three of them are finally together, but sadly, they are unable to call for help. With no other option, they are forced to leave the room and look for a phone. Just then, they encounter Shaba and Anais in the living room, both wearing dog masks. They demand one thing, an eye for an eye, a life for another, meaning they want to kill Teresa for killing their child Jagger. Alarmed, Roy stays behind to stall them while his daughter and wife run to seek help. Fabiola and Teresa make it to the neighbor Jorge's house. However, when they ring the bell, nobody opens the door. Fabiola then instructs her daughter to enter inside through the pet door. Teresa manages to do so, but soon after, Shaba attacks Fabiola from behind. Meanwhile, inside the house, Teresa finds Jorge tied up and unable to move. Shaba then drags Fabiola back to her house and leaves again to capture Teresa. However, when he arrives at Jorge's house, he sees that the man is free and protecting the little girl. Jorge, a local boxer, easily beats up Shaba and leaves him injured on the ground. Following this, he and Teresa try to escape, unaware that Anais is nearby. Just as they are running for their lives, she suddenly appears from behind a bush and slashes Jorge's throat, killing him on the spot. In the meantime, an injured Shaba returns to Roy and Fabiola's place. He reveals his plan to the captive couple. He will make their little girl, Teresa, suffer just like Jagger did. Shaba then shows them an electrocution machine and a dog repellent, which he intends to use to torture Teresa. However, until Anais brings over the little girl, Shaba wants to have some fun with the couple. Roy, weakened from losing a lot of blood, asks for a drink and a cigarette, reminding Shaba of their once close bond. Shaba agrees to his pleas and confidently unties Roy to light his cigarette. Unknown to him, Roy has a plan. Once free, Roy quickly grabs the dog repellent can and sprays it in Shaba's face just as he is lighting the fire. As a result, Shaba endures severe burns to his face but angrily retaliates by turning on the electrocution machine and zapping Roy, ending his life. Fabiola is severely disturbed to see her husband pass away, but she can do nothing but mourn for him. In the meantime, Anais disposes of Jorge and returns home with Teresa. She sees her husband's face is entirely burnt and that Roy is dead, which devastates her not because her husband suffered severe burns, but because he killed Roy. She wanted Fabiola and Roy to witness Teresa's excruciating death before killing them. Regardless, Anais takes her husband to another room to treat his wounds. While they are away, the little girl cleverly manages to free her mother. Just as they are about to escape, Anais returns to the room. Before she can react, Fabiola grabs a bottle and smacks her on the head. Anais falls to the ground and hits her head on a piece of furniture, leaving her unconscious. For an activist, she sure doesn't treat the trees very well. After a while, Shaba returns to the living room and discovers his wife lying lifeless on the floor. Devastated, he grabs a knife and becomes determined to avenge her death. He investigates the entire house and finally reaches the upper floor where Fabiola and Teresa are hiding. The two try their best to stay hidden, but the sound of the stuffed dog blows their cover. In a fit of rage, Shaba begins to attack them, and Fabiola fights back with all her strength. She eventually manages to grab a hook and injure him in the neck. Shaba is finally incapacitated as he groans in pain and slowly retreats to the floor. Seizing the chance, Fabiola and Teresa hastily get out of the room and head downstairs. They go to the living room where Anais is lying on the floor. Fabiola quickly takes the car keys from Anais' pocket as it is their only means of escape. After a while, the mother-daughter duo makes it to the vehicle and gets inside. However, just as they are about to start the engine, Fabiola, consumed by revenge, decides to make sure that Shaba is dead for good. She leaves her daughter in the car and returns to the house once again. In the next scene, Fabiola grabs a golf club and heads upstairs, determined not to give Shaba a second chance. She relentlessly strikes him until he is completely dead. With her revenge fulfilled, she heads downstairs to reunite with her daughter. However, upon reaching the ground floor, she discovers that Anais is no longer there. This frightens her, and she suddenly realizes that her daughter is in trouble. Fabiola then runs outside only to discover that it is already too late. It turns out that Anais, who was thought to be dead, was only unconscious at the time. When she woke up, she went outside and abducted Teresa. Thankfully, this time they hear Roy's voice. Although he is excessively bleeding from one of his knees, he has managed to make it to the room. The three of them are finally together, but sadly, they are unable to call for help. With no other option, they are forced to leave the room and look for a phone. Just then, they encounter Shaba and Anai in the living room, both wearing dog masks. They demand one thing, an eye for an eye, a life for another, meaning they want to kill Teresa for killing their child Jagger. Alarmed, Roy stays behind to stall them while his daughter and wife run to seek help. Fabiola and Teresa make it to the neighbor Jorge's house. However, when they ring the bell, nobody opens the door. Fabiola then instructs her daughter to enter inside through the pet door. Teresa manages to do so, but soon after, Shaba attacks Fabiola from behind. Meanwhile, inside the house, Teresa finds Jorge tied up and unable to move. Shaba then drags Fabiola back to her house and leaves again to capture Teresa. However, when he arrives at Jorge's house, he sees that the man is free and protecting the little girl. Jorge, a local boxer, easily beats up Shaba and leaves him injured on the ground. Following this, he and Teresa try to escape, unaware that Anai is nearby. Just as they are running for their lives, she suddenly appears from behind a bush and slashes Jorge's throat, killing him on the spot.